Hey guys, it's Amber. Today I'm sharing how I set up my digital stamps in Photoshop in order to print and color them. This is highly requested by you guys, so I hope you enjoy it. I use Adobe Photoshop 2020 for my images. If you don't use Photoshop, hopefully you can translate this to whatever program you use. I'll start by opening a new file and I'm going to change some of the settings. I'll go ahead and put in a title. I'm going to set this as A2 template 6x9 canvas. So my canvas is going to be 6x9 inches, and I'm going to change the settings for that. You'll see this here. The reason I set it for 6x9 is because that's a half sheet of watercolor paper. I typically use a 9x12 pad, and then if I'm coloring, Copic coloring, I'll use a half sheet of Nina, which is 5.5 by 8.5. I can use this same 6x9 template to print out both of those size sheets. I just change the size of the paper when I'm in the print dialog box. So I'll show you that at the end of the video. I'm going to change the resolution to 300 pixels per inch, and I'll leave the rest of it alone. I'll click create, and now I have a 6x9 inch canvas. Now I'm going to create some guidelines, so I'll go to View, New Guide Layout, and I already have mine preset, but I'll go ahead and change this to default so you can see what that looks like. I'm not going to use columns. What I want to work with is the margins. My goal here is to set up some guidelines so that I can visually see the A2 format. So I'm going to change my top guideline to 0.75 inches. That just gives me a little bit of room at the top because my printer doesn't print all the way to the edge of the paper. The bottom is going to be 2.75. And so what the space in between those two lines is going to be 5.5 inches. Then my left and right borders are going to be 0.875 inches. So again, what's inside these blue lines is a 4.25 by 5.5 inch space. That's a standard A2 size card. Now you could also set this up for like a slimline design. You can set it up for whatever size card you're doing. If you want a 5x7 card, then set up your guides accordingly for that. Next, I'm going to grab the rectangle tool here. So once I've selected the rectangle tool, I'm just going to click on my canvas, and that'll bring up the dialog panel so that I can put in a custom size. What I want to put here is 4.5 inches by 5.75 inches. That's an 1/8 inch larger all the way around compared to an A2 size card. So this is going to give me some wiggle room. So again, this is going to be, so let me add a stroke. I'm adding a black stroke, which is a black outline, which you don't really need. I just kind of like it visually. It works for me. And I'm just going to drag this in. I've turned it a light gray so that I can see it. And this is another visual guide for me. The other thing that happens with this is this will print out, and I'll be able to line up my A2 size die, or even if I use a smaller one, cleanly and straight. I'll be able to align it to this rectangle so that I get everything cut. You can also use this as trim lines if you're using your paper trimmer. So now I'll start dragging in some images. So I have Precious Flowers from Alex Syberia here. This is a ping file. So a ping file will have a transparent background, and then this particular image isn't just the outline, it also has a white fill. So if you hover over the corner of your image, the rotation guide will show up and you'll be able to rotate it. I right mouse clicked on the layer over to the right and clicked on duplicate because I want to arrange a couple of these. It's going to add a little more interest to my composition and then some more depth. So when I'm resizing my images, I grab the corner of the image and hold down the shift button so that it resizes uniformly. You don't want to skew the image and distort it. So make sure you hold down that shift key if you're using Photoshop. If you're using another program, it may be different. So I'll just go ahead and arrange these. Then I'm going to layer them on top of each other. Because it has the white fill, you won't see the other image behind it. And I'll just play around with these a little bit until I get an arrangement that I'm happy with. So now what I want to do is drop in a digital paper background. So I have a background here. This is from the Coffee Lovers digital paper set from Alex Syberia Design. So I'll have all of the products that I use linked down below. I've dragged that in and overlaid it over my flowers, and so I'm going to drag it down so that it's the layer right on top of the rectangle that we made in the second step of this video. And there's too many slats there, so I'm going to go ahead and drag this to enlarge the image. I want really large wood slats, so you can resize this however large you want it. Now the reason I want them larger is because there's very dark lines in between the slats, and I feel like that can be distracting to the overall composition. So I'll enlarge it so that there's less of those lines. I'll get it positioned how I think it's visually pleasing. And then what I'm going to do, I don't want to print this entire background because that's going to needlessly waste toner. All I need is the area inside those lines. So I'll create a clipping mask. Right mouse click on your layer and then click create clipping mask. Now it's important that your background layer is on top of the rectangle layer in this layer guide over here, as you can see here. Otherwise it's not going to create that clipping mask correctly. So now it's time to add our sentiment. Now, what I'm showing you here is the flowers overhang, but that's not going to waste a lot of toner. That's just a few black lines, no big deal. So I'm not going to spend the time to create a clipping mask for the flowers. So for my font, I typically will use a white font for part of the sentiment, and then I might do the other part of the sentiment black, and that's what I'm going to show here. So I'm going to set it up as two separate words. I'm going to have a two-word sentiment for hello, and I think it's a good idea to do a sans serif. You could maybe even change part of the font to a script or hand lettered type of font. I think mixing it up. In this case, I'm going to use all caps and lowercase for this font, and then also different sizes. So I'll go ahead and resize it over on the right with all of the options that you have for text. I'm going to change hello black, so I'll just change the color here. And then for the lovely, I'll leave that white, but what I want to do is add an outline around it. The outline will give it a more finished appearance, and it'll also match the digital stamp flower as well. So I'm going to go over, I'm going to select the layer over on the layers panel. I'm going to go down to the FX or effects, and I'm going to choose stroke. Stroke again is that outline just like we did on the rectangle. And you can change how large you want the outline. There's 10, which is super thick, too thick to match my stamp. So I'm going to drop it back down to 6. And I think that that's a good compromise. It's a little thicker than the stamped image, but I think it frames the lovely nicely. So the reason I like to have a white sentiment like this is because I'm going to Copic color it to match my flowers. It would be so difficult to get your printer to color match what you're going to color with Copics, just nearly impossible. So I like to have it white so that I can color it to match the flowers as I'm coloring the flowers. So I like this setup. Once I'm happy with it, I'll go ahead and go to File, Print. And there's a couple settings to look for here. So you can see my printer is listed up top, and every printer is going to be different. So I'm going to click on printer settings. You want to make sure that your printer is managing the color. I find that I get better color matching that way. And I'm going to change the paper size. So I have a 6x9, 5x7, and 5.5 by 8.5 already saved. But you can go to Manage Custom Sizes, and you can see my profiles there. You want to click on the plus button, and you can title it whatever you like. You can do 6x9 or A2, 5.5 by 8.5, and then go ahead and change the sizes here. And you don't need any margins or non-printable area. Just go ahead and set that to 0 and just change your size. So I would do 5.5 by 8.5 because I'm going to Copic color this. I already have that saved, so I'll choose that, and then I'll go to the print settings. And this is really important, you guys. You're going to be printing on cardstock, so you want to choose the thickest paper setting that you have. And then if your printer has a manual feed, you want to use the manual feed. If I use tray 1, the cardstock is going to have to spool around those spools. It's going to have to curl around the spools and then come out the front. I'll also change one of the other settings to reduce the paper curl. when I use the manual feed, the paper goes straight in the front of the printer and straight out the back, so it doesn't have to curl around anything. That means my cardstock is going to come out nice and flat and not be curled. It's also much easier on the printer because it doesn't have to pull that thick cardstock around the spools. So here's the printed version, and my printer will usually print things a little bit darker, so if I wanted to lighten up the wood, I could have changed the opacity of the background layer and lightened that up a little bit. Here you can see how I have the die. This is an A2 size die, so 4¼ by 5½, and how that extra little bit of background helps me get that lined up perfectly. This is the finished card, and I'll put a link to this video up in the right-hand corner so you can see how I've colored it. But basically, with this half sheet of paper, it gives me this room on the bottom to test my colors and then record the colors that I'm going to use so that I can share it with you guys in the videos. I hope you enjoyed this video and you find it helpful, and if you don't use Photoshop, that you can translate this to some of the other programs that you might be using. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, liking, and ringing that bell so you don't miss any new inspiration. Here's a couple more videos for you before you leave, and I'll see you real soon.